What's going on? Welcome to Tech with Sean. And growing up, my very first game console was the Nintendo Entertainment System. So today, I wanted to show you my top 10 personal NES games. Alright, first up in the number 10 spot, we have Mike Tyson's Punchout. Punchout was like a hybrid between a sports game and a rhythm game, and the big detailed opponents, including its namesake Mike Tyson, were a huge part of the game's appeal. It was easy to understand and play, yet extremely difficult to beat. Punch-Out appealed to a wide variety of gamers and was a staple title in the NES library. Mario himself makes a cameo appearance as the referee. There were several boxing games that would be released on the NES, but Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is the champ if you ask me. One note about Punch-Out, the timing in the combat is very important, so if you're playing on an HD TV or via an emulator, that can present an issue in some setups, particularly against the later, tougher enemies. Ideally, you want to play Punch-Out on an NES hooked up to a CRT TV, but if you're playing on the NES Mini, a computer or whatever, a high refresh rate gaming monitor will have less input lag than most TVs. But if you are playing on an HD TV, make sure to set it for game mode, because that should significantly reduce your input lag. Alright, at number 9 we have Kirbys Adventure. By the time this game released in 1993, I think I had already moved on to the Super Nintendo, so this wasn't a game that I actually played back in the NES days, but it's one I've come to enjoy later on. I think that later release meant that developers had really gotten to know how to program for the NES, because this is a great looking title for the system. Developed along with HAL Laboratory, Masahiro Sakurai of Super Smash fame was the designer and director of this game, with Satoru Iwata and Shigeru Miyamoto serving as the producers. The gameplay is satisfying even today. This was the second game in the Kirby series, yet it was actually the first to introduce the classic Kirby mechanic of copying the enemies that he swallows. The stylized, colorful graphics hold up better today than the visuals of some other games of the era. Alright, for my number 8, I'm going to cheat a little bit, and I'm going to say Dragon Warrior, or rather, the Dragon Warrior series. Published by Enix in Japan, but Nintendo in America, the original Dragon Quest, renamed Dragon Warrior for the US release, basically laid the blueprints for Japanese console RPGs. The series was already on its third installment in Japan when the original game came out in the US, so it may not have seemed revolutionary at the time, but Dragon Quest went on to spawn a lasting series that is still going strong today. The NES Dragon Quest games evolved greatly, with 3 and 4 being a large step ahead of the first two in terms of quality and scope. 3 introduced the job system, and 4 had a very memorable story and cast of characters for an RPG of the time, and that really influenced what future entries and what many other JRPGs would play like in the future. I'm putting the original Dragon Warrior on my list because it's the one that started it all, and it's the one I remember the most, but if you're really looking to play the original games today, I would honestly recommend trying 3 or 4 on the NES because they're really just better games. I just have the most nostalgia for this one. These older titles have also been re-released on mobile phones, the Nintendo Switch, and various systems with graphical and quality of life updates for the menus and controls. No matter how you play through them, the Dragon Quest or Dragon Warrior series is definitely worth checking out if you're even vaguely interested in role-playing games. Alright, coming in at number 7, we got the OG, the dual cartridge of Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt. In 1988, Nintendo released the NES packaged together with the Zapper and this dual cartridge with Super Mario Bros. And Duck Hunt. This was called the Action Set, and it was the system that my family got when I was a kid. I remember this being super popular at the time. The amount of these dual game cartridges you find compared to plain Super Mario Bros. Or Duck Hunt cartridges is kind of proof of that. This combo was great for people getting into gaming at the time. Duck Hunt really brought home the arcade light gun experience in a big way. And what can you even really say about Super Mario Bros.? It's an iconic game that spawned one of the biggest video game franchises ever, and this game is really what defined it early on. It was synonymous with the Nintendo Entertainment System. At number 6, we have Castlevania. What do you get when you cross a solid NES action platform game with classic Hollywood monster movie themes? Well, you get Konami's hit game Castlevania. I believe I first saw this on a PlayChoice 10 cabinet in a Pizza Hut or something, and it really struck a chord with me as a kid who is a big fan of Halloween, monster movies, and all that type of stuff. The dark vibe and creepy music really stood out compared to other games at the time, which were generally designed to be seen as unthreatening to children with saccharinely sweet music, colors, and characters. Some parents have thought video games were the devil since forever, I guess. But in this game, you fight against the vampires and monsters, playing as Simon Belmont, who ascends through the castle equipped with various items and his trademark whip to take on Dracula. Castlevania had 2 direct sequels on the NES. Castlevania 2 was interesting, yet had some pretty obtuse game design decisions, but Castlevania 3 is seen as a classic also, and took everything that was good with the first 2 games and turned it up to the next level. All the NES Castlevania games are worth checking out, if you ask me. Number 5. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2, the arcade game. The Ninja Turtles series was huge in the late 80s and early 90s. The first Ninja Turtles game on the NES was really difficult and kind of weird, but the second game, wow. This was a revelation at the time. The NES already had other beat-em-up games like Double Dragon and Bad Dudes, but firing up Ninja Turtles 2 the arcade game at home with my brother basically felt just like we were playing on the actual cabinet in the arcade. It had relatively big sprites for an NES beat-em-up, great music, and the gameplay was on point. You could play 2 players simultaneously, and each player could choose from one of the 4 main turtles to play as. I like Donatello. There were a couple new levels added from the original ones in the arcade, making this a game you could eventually clear in a single sitting, but not one that you could just breeze through so quickly that you felt unsatisfied. Now at number 4, we've got Mega Man 2. Mega Man was a good NES game. Mega Man 2 was a great one. Capcom took the basic ideas behind Mega Man 1 and basically improved on everything. The gameplay and controls, music, characters, robot bosses, and powers were all a step up from the previous game. Mega Man 2's levels feel expertly crafted the whole way through, and the gameplay is so tight that you just want to keep on pressing through to get to Dr. Wily's castle. There were a lot, 6 Mega Man games on the NES, but this second one remains my favorite. It just oozes personality, and it was what a lot of gamers were looking for at the time. It wouldn't do to talk about Mega Man 2 and not mention the amazing soundtrack though. Capcom is well regarded for their game's music, and this was one of the titles that really cemented them as one of the greats. I still listen to it today from time to time. Wily's Castle Stage 1 is one of the greatest video game songs of all time in my opinion. Back to the game itself, it's a basic action platformer at first glance, but each stage is capped off by a battle with a robot boss that has a special power that you can obtain after defeating them, and each boss is weak against one of the other boss's weapons, adding an interesting dynamic to the combat. Mega Man 2 is one of the greatest NES games ever, and if for some reason you've never played it, you should fix that ASAP. Coming in at number 3 on my list, we have Super Mario Bros. 3. Castles, card games, P-Wings, frog suits, Hammer Brothers, warp whistles, pyramids, pipes, really big pipes, Tanuki suits, the original Mario Bros. Arcade game. Nintendo threw everything they had into the final NES Mario game, Super Mario Bros. 3. The hype for this game was off the charts from extensive media and magazine coverage leading up to the release, and amazingly the game lived up to the lofty expectations. Super Mario Bros. 2 in Japan, aka the Lost Levels in Super Mario All-Stars, was not what we would consider a true sequel by today's game standards, and had been deemed too similar to Mario 1 and too difficult for a North American release. The Mario 2 we got here in the US was a rebranded game, and later it was released in Japan as Super Mario USA, so really, Super Mario Bros. 3 was the true successor to the original Super Mario Bros. They held nothing back for this release, everything was new. There were new game mechanics and power-ups, new enemies, an overworld map screen that connected the levels, which was itself packed with secrets and different activities. If I had to come up with one complaint, it would be that a battery save would have been really awesome when I was a kid. There were no save states back then. I remember turning off the TV but leaving the NES on a few times overnight. Truly a landmark release, Super Mario Bros. 3 is considered by many to be one of the best games of all time, and it's a must-play title for anyone even remotely interested in getting into the NES library. Number 2 on my list of best NES games, Final Fantasy. This fantasy turned out to be more first than final, as Hironobu Sakaguchi helmed the crew at Square to bring us the first of many entries in this well-known role-playing series. Back in the day, I remember seeing the new issue of Nintendo Power, and the entire thing was a strategy guide for just one game. What kind of game could have or even need such a tome? I was immediately pulled in by the sheer volume of information, the artwork, the characters, and the lore, and I just had to have the game. I had played some other adventure and role-playing like games on the NES, but the production values of Final Fantasy were really on another level. It seems simple by today's standards, but being able to see your whole party and the enemies on the screen at once, along with the attacks and spell effects, was something really cool at the time. The world was huge and full of interesting locations. The soundtrack was composed by Nobuo Uematsu, who would go on to become quite famous from his contributions to the series. Character designs were done by Yoshitaka Amano, known for his ethereal and dreamy style. Sakaguchi and the team took these creative elements and wove them together into a fairly cohesive package, which was really heads and tails above what other role-playing games were doing on the NES at the time. The Final Fantasy series has reinvented itself with each iteration, but this original release established many recurring series concepts, and it stands tall among the best RPGs on the system. This game released early on in the North American NES library, and it really showed everybody what open world games could be about. As someone who was already blown away by Super Mario Bros. With its 8 different levels, being dropped into a game like Zelda with a big world that stretched out in seemingly every direction, it seemed like it should have been impossible. The game was also super intriguing. It was like an enigma wrapped in a logic puzzle, wrapped in a Japanese action-adventure game. The instruction manual gave you some basic tips. There was an included partial map which had some blank parts you could fill in, but even with that much assistance, it was really hard to tackle. None of us had ever played a game like this. Tips from Nintendo Power magazine and schoolyard strategies were key back in the day. I remember getting the hugest sense of accomplishment when I finally took down Ganon for the first time. I'm sure it cost them a boatload of money, but I think Nintendo made a really smart move by electing to include a battery save on Zelda. In Japan, it had been a Famicom Disk System game, and if they had just included a basic password system on a regular NES cartridge, it would have been much more cumbersome to continue your progress, and I doubt that as many people would have stuck with it. In the game, the world of Hyrule had a lot of unique enemies and locations, and the amazing soundtrack by Koji Kondo really sold the experience. It showed off the kind of high-quality music that could be brought out from the NES hardware fairly early on in its life cycle. This first Zelda game literally revolutionized and set the blueprints for console action-adventure games, and also influenced many future role-playing games. Zelda has grown to be one of Nintendo's biggest franchises, with the last major release, Breath of the Wild, finding great success by taking a lot of influence from this original NES release. People like the tried-and-true Zelda method of presenting the player with a well-crafted and interesting world full of puzzles, action, and adventure, no matter what system it's on. This game was the origin though, the genesis that kicked off that feeling way back in 1987, and that's why The Legend of Zelda is my #1 NES game. I hope you liked watching this top 10 video. I had a lot of fun making it. Let me know what you think of the rankings and how you might change them down in the comments below. If you haven't subscribed already, make sure you do that, and I'll see you in the next video.